Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are. I'm Ian Gary. I'm the Executive Director of the Financial Accountability and Corporate Transparency, or FACT Coalition. I'm delighted to welcome you to this conversation with Casey Michel, as well as a discussion of some of the issues and reform measures that can be taken to address the issues that are raised in Casey's new book. We're happy to co-sponsor this event with Transparency International US. After some conversation with Casey, we'll be turning to our panelists, Elaine Dazinski, who is a senior director and head of the Center on Economic and Financial Power at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, and Scott Graytack, director of advocacy at Transparency International US chapter, to talk about some of the policy reforms and advocacy that needs to happen to address some of the issues raised by Casey's new book, which is Foreign Agents: How American Lobbyists and Lawmakers Threaten Democracy Around the World. Casey is also the author of American Kleptocracy, and we were delighted to host Casey for a book talk a few years ago. American Kleptocracy was named by The Economist as one of the best books to read to understand financial crime. Casey is also, and I don't know how you find time to do all of this, but he's also the director of the Combating Kleptocracy program with the Human Rights Foundation. So we're going to kick off to the discussion now, Casey. Your book opens with the story of Ivy Lee, an American who was instrumental in the birth of the public relations industry, and someone who helped Nazi Germany in the 1930s boost its image in the US and understand how Americans were perceiving Hitler's Germany during that time. Ivy Lee even met with Hitler to, quote unquote, better understand him, as you relay in the book. So your book shows that foreign or lobbying for foreign governments, even some of the most noxious foreign governments in history, has a really long tail. Could you talk a bit about what your central thesis is and why this is such a huge problem?
Sure. Thanks so much, Ian, for having me today. Of course, thanks to the FACT Coalition and TI and Elaine and Scott for joining me. Ian, I should say I don't know how many more books I'm going to write in this life, but I do think at this point my favorite tradition is having a book talk with you and the entire team at FACT. So it's great to be joining you for this one. I mean, look, the thesis and the thrust of this book, Foreign Agents, is simple. It is that the foreign lobbying industry in the United States of America, these are the generally American firms and American figures that act as mouthpieces for, in many cases, foot soldiers for foreign regimes, especially foreign dictators, typically in Washington, D.C., but increasingly around the United States of America as well. This is an industry that is worth billions of dollars now. It is an industry that has been overlooked for years, and it is an industry that has helped put democracy on the back foot in country after country around the world, and increasingly here in the United States of America as well. This is an industry, and again, full of Americans, that has helped entrench dictators, autocrats, and authoritarians through their perfectly legal services. I'm sure we'll get a little bit further into the actual legal architecture of lobbying, but at the end of the day, lobbying is a constitutionally protected right that these Americans are offering, not for themselves or for any kind of domestic considerations or domestic clients, but doing so on behalf of foreign regimes, and again, foreign kleptocratic regimes and their oligarchic proxies as well. Again, all for the betterment, all for the entrenchment of those regimes, and all to help undercut democratic movements around the world. And as you just mentioned, Ian, I think a lot of folks are increasingly aware of this industry, of how some of these networks operate, of who is involved in some of these networks and what they're doing on the ground in Washington, D.C. and elsewhere, which is wonderful. I am very grateful for folks paying more attention. Hopefully that means they're also buying copies of this book, Foreign Agents, which I know would make both my publisher and my wife very happy. But this is an industry that has existed not just for the past couple years or even for the past decade, but really goes back to the beginning of the 20th century, as we understand it. Certainly, as I argue in this book, as you mentioned, there's one figure in particular that I focus on in the early 20th century, a gentleman named Ivy Lee, who, if folks are aware of him, is still considered the father of the public relations industry. He invented the first press release. He created the crisis management playbook. He worked with really a who's who in the United States at the time of tycoons and politicians, the Rockefellers and Woodrow Wilson and Charles Schwab. But then he took his talents abroad, and he worked with Benito Mussolini in Rome. He worked with the Soviet leadership in Moscow, and he worked most notoriously with Adolf Hitler and the Nazi regime in the 1930s in Berlin, showing them how to open doors in the United States of America, how to target Americans, and even beyond that, how to really create the playbook for foreign lobbying and foreign influence that we see to this day. So he wasn't only the father of the PR industry, he's very much the father of the foreign lobbying industry as well.
Great. I would say that your book is both hard to put down, but also sometimes you want to put it down because it's so enraging, or you want to throw it across the room. I mean, there's so many examples in this book of just the shamelessness of these lobbyists. So I wondered if you could share a couple of examples that maybe are particularly enraging, and examples that people might not be as familiar with as some of the other more recent examples.
Sure. Well, look, I think there are certainly some recent examples that folks are aware of that has been keeping this in the news. Some of the recent indictments and convictions, folks like now former Senator Bob Menendez, who was convicted of conspiring to act as a foreign agent on behalf of the Egyptian government. There's another member of the House of Representatives right now, Henry Cuellar, who is indicted on and alleged to be a foreign agent on behalf of the dictatorship in Azerbaijan. Again, these are especially egregious examples because these are sitting members of Congress. And I can say with confidence, because I put this book together, this is the first time in American history in nearly 250 years that sitting members of Congress, both the House and the Senate, have been indicted on, and in Menendez's case, convicted on, acting as a foreign agent or on foreign agents related charges. I mean, it's difficult to get more egregious than that. But I think, as you mentioned a moment ago, Ian, look, there were plenty of times when I was putting this book together when I was getting, I don't know, overly depressed or distraught about the state of affairs, especially to see how much this industry has grown, how few prosecutions there were, of course, how few successful convictions there were. I wanted to make sure that the book didn't come across as too overly depressing or distressing. So I wanted to include a few, I suppose you could call them fun stories. There was one gentleman in particular that I, again, I suppose all things considered, enjoyed writing about. A gentleman named Edward von Kloberg, who, as memory serves, von was his not his given name. He just attached it to himself to make him appear more, I don't know, authoritative. But he was operating, especially in the 1990s. And he was, again, I think he kind of sums up the ethos of so much of this industry itself, because he wasn't just working with, you know, authoritarian regimes who are nominally American allies in places like, whether it's Azerbaijan or Saudi Arabia, or even the Hungaries and the Turkeys of the world. I mean, he was working for thoroughly anti-American and, of course, dictatorial regimes themselves. He was working with Liberia's Samuel Doe. He was working most especially with Iraq's Saddam Hussein, acting as their lobbyist in Washington, and again, committing no crimes whatsoever, because so much of this is legal, so much of this is above board, so long as they register their work with the Department of Justice. It's not funny that he was working with Doe or with Saddam. What was funny for me was that he, and this is again one of these details you can't really make up, he likes to plaster his bathroom with photos of him and assorted dictators from around the world. And he enjoyed doing so while wearing a cape as well. So again, this is one of these kind of larger than life figures you find in this space. He, again, summing up the ethos of this industry, he gave me the title of one of the chapters of the book. When he said, you know, a journalist asked him if he felt any shame working for any of these regimes whatsoever. And he said, no, of course not. You know, at the end of the day, he's in it for the money. And as he says, shame is for sissies, which is the title of, again, of one of the chapters itself. So he's He's no longer with us. I don't know what happened to all his bathroom photos. I suppose they're probably floating around somewhere.
And as some of the cases you've already mentioned, this is really a problem that spans the political spectrum, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah. Yes, absolutely.
and there's no real distinction in terms of like which political party is more vulnerable. There's plenty of cases
No.
across the political spectrum.
Oh, 1,000%. I mean, I mentioned a few figures just a moment ago. Bob Menendez out of the Senate, now resigned, and Henry Cuellar, who's still a member of the House of Representatives. Both of those are members of the Democratic Party, longstanding members of the Democratic Party. I mean, even most recently here in beautiful New York City, where I'm coming to you from today, we had your beloved mayor was recently indicted on not technically foreign agents related charges, but by all appearances, foreign lobbying and foreign agents related charges for not only acting on behalf of the Turkish government, but overtly soliciting donations from Turkish officials. Again, a member of the Democratic Party. But of course, you also have plenty of members on the Republican side who are acting as cutouts for agents of influence for foreign regimes around the world. The other key figure, in addition to Ivy Lee in the book, is a gentleman I think a lot of folks remember. I think a lot of folks are familiar with, and that is Paul Manafort, a long-standing member of the kind of Republican firmament. Was close to Gerald Ford, was close to Ronald Reagan, and really made his chops as a domestic lobbyist in the United States of America, working for especially, not exclusively, but especially Republican clients. And then in the 1990s and the 2000s, taking again his talents to some of the world's worst dictators, in places like Angola or Somalia, Nigeria, the Philippines, and again most memorably in places like Ukraine with Viktor Yanukovych, before joining Donald Trump's campaign in 2016 and acting as his campaign manager. I mean, we could sit here all day and talk about examples on both sides of the aisle, but unfortunately, one of the reasons this has been such a difficult topic to tackle in the first place, and I know we'll talk with Scott more about this later, is the bipartisan element, because this does cross such ideological spectrums, because all too often it's not actually done. These are not Americans signing up clients for ideological reasons. They're doing it for financial reasons, and they're doing it because they know full well if they turn down a potential dictatorial client who comes to them asking for their services, whether it's in consulting or public relations or even on the legal side of things, if they turn them down, then there's another firm or another figure, either down K Street or elsewhere, that will be all too happy to sign them up. So yes, it is a massive issue that spans the ideological spectrum.
And we've talked a lot about how this is benefiting politicians, but as you note, there are a lot of other beneficiaries in the system, universities, think tanks, others. Could you talk about who those beneficiaries are and what the impact is?
Absolutely. I mean, look, of course, you have the firms themselves that are making money hand over foot, making millions of dollars themselves to represent these regimes. And the industry itself is now worth billions of dollars itself. But it's not just these PR firms or consultancies or law firms that certainly I argue, and I would argue we now see as part of the foreign lobbying space itself. But as you just mentioned, those operating in the nonprofit space have been making money hand over fist as these kind of emerging avenues, emerging vectors for foreign influence and foreign lobbying. I write about a few of them in the book itself. I write about things, like the Clinton Foundation, which was accepting millions, in some cases tens of millions of dollars from, again, some truly heinous regimes that was not earmarked clearly for political influence, but again, looking at the numbers and looking at the patterns of financing, was very obviously meant as an avenue for influencing what regimes thought was going to be a President Hillary Clinton. We see the funding spike in 2008, and while she's Secretary of State, we see it spike again in 2016, and then it's fallen something like 75 or 80% ever since. I mean, that's, again, just one example of many. But increasingly, places like the university and the think tank sector as well. And we actually just saw yet another recent indictment of a woman named Asumi Terry, who was indicted on foreign lobbying related charges for acting as an unregistered agent for the government of South Korea, which is, again, a democratic ally, not an authoritarian regime, but again, acting as an unregistered agent. And she was very much, and maybe remains very much, the go-to kind of think tanker in the Korean analysis space, both North Korea and South Korea. And according to the indictment, was helping mask funding directly to her think tank on the ground in Washington. And of course, that's in addition to any number of other think tanks that are accepting far more money from the Azerbaijans, the Kazakhstans, the United Arab Emirates of the world, much of which we still do not know about, much of which remains undisclosed because there are no transparency requirements for think tanks. Again, these are just a few of the kind of pieces of the lattice work building out of the foreign influence industry writ large, which is growing every single year.
And how do you think this has become so normalized? What's your theory of and now it just seems like air and water. It doesn't seem like shocking to people anymore. And I hope one of the impacts of your book will be to shock people. But why do you think it's become so normalized?
The phrase that it has come up time and again in putting the book together, now having the book come out, is that, at the end of the day, in foreign lobbying in the United States, the scandal is not what is illegal. The scandal is not what is a crime. The scandal is what is legal and has become, as you said a moment ago, Ian, normalized, because this has been going on for years. Of course, it goes all the way back to the early 20th century, but it's really in the post-Cold War period when this industry has just exploded, and again continues to grow year in and year out. And I suspect part of the reason it's become normalized is because, again, no crimes generally are being committed. Again, Americans have that First Amendment protection to lobby on behalf of whomever they would like for whatever reason they would like to. You, me, Scott, Elaine, we can freely and legally lobby for whatever we would like to, whether in Congress in Washington or state level governments or municipal governments. But increasingly, an increasing number of Americans, again, decide to use those constitutional protections on behalf of foreign governments and foreign regimes, and do so without committing any crimes whatsoever, so long as they're disclosing their work. I think, or I suspect more particularly, there are a few key figures that I write about in the book that helped really launch that process of normalization. And one of those, which was surprising for me and remains surprising in conversations I have like this, was Bob Dole, who I think, again, a lot of folks remember from the 1996 presidential campaign, eventually lost to Bill Clinton, but one of the real titans of the Senate, right? His nickname was the Lion of the Senate, and still viewed as part of this more bipartisan era in the United States in recent American history. And understandably so, and maybe even rightfully so. But what I think a lot of folks either didn't know or have potentially forgotten, which hopefully this book will remind them, is that when Dole left the Senate in the late 90s, early 2000s, he didn't just go and retire. He didn't go write his memoirs or retire to his estate, what have you. He almost immediately became and registered as a foreign agent, as a foreign lobbyist, working on behalf of some American allies in places like Kosovo or Taiwan, but also working on behalf of some, again, truly authoritarian regimes in places like the Democratic Republic of Congo, or in this case, most notoriously, for a Russian oligarch named Oleg Deripaska, who, again, folks may recall, Mr. Deripaska is and remains to this day one of President Putin's closest allies in the Kremlin. He's now sanctioned by the United States and the European Union, and is very much a key prong of Russian influence efforts in the US and elsewhere. But for a substantial period of time, Bob Dole was his mouthpiece in Washington, D.C., and Dole himself and his law firm at the time were making significant money acting as Deripaska's mouthpiece, foot soldier, whatever term you like, doing so perfectly legally. And all of this is to say, I suspect that as people watched what former Senator Dole, as a foreign agent, was doing, I think a lot of folks in Washington thought to themselves, look, if Senator Dole can do this, then I can, then anyone can. And again, it's not that he's getting away with anything because he's not committing any crimes, but if he has the moral flexibility to sign up clients like the DRC or Oleg Deripaska, then why shouldn't the rest of these American firms and figures themselves?
Mm-hmm. Let's turn a bit to the efforts that have been made to deal with this problem, and then looking towards the future, we'll also bring Scott and Elaine in terms of what kinds of policy reforms are needed. But the Foreign Agents Registration Act is almost like a character in your book. And I think more people have become aware of this relatively obscure law. And once they read your book, they will know it intimately. But could you talk a bit about, what are the major, this has been a big, effort to deal with this problem. That's important legislation. But what are some of the loopholes in FARA, and what would stronger enforcement look like?
Sure, sure. So the Foreign Agents Registration Act goes back to 1938, and it was a direct outgrowth of the revelations about what that gentleman we talked about earlier, Ivy Lee, was doing on behalf of the fascist regimes in Rome and Berlin, and then as well as the Soviets in Moscow. And it was a very progressive piece of legislation. It remains so to this day. And it's a relatively simple piece of legislation. It does not ban foreign lobbying. It does not make any of these activities illegal. It simply requires transparency about what these firms and figures are doing. So if you're a foreign lobbyist in the United States of America, you can, by and large, work with whatever regime or whichever oligarchic figure, again, so long as they're not necessarily sanctioned. And as long as you are disclosing that work to the Department of Justice, which then in turn discloses that work to the rest of the United States, you can continue as long as you want. As long as you disclose what you're doing, who you're doing it for, and how much money you're making, you can continue making all that money as the day is long. It requires transparency at the end of the day, and that was really the thrust. That was kind of the idea of this piece of legislation in the first place. Is if the American populace and the American public knew what these figures were doing, then potentially they could be shamed into no longer working with the Mussolinis or the Hitlers or the Putins or the Xis of the world. Again, it's a kind of a nice quaint notion that legislators or firms could be shamed into stopping this work, but that's what they were working with. Now, unfortunately, there are kind of two big things that have happened in the intervening, 75, 80 years or so. One is that this piece of legislation was effectively forgotten for decades, for nearly 65, 70 years thereafter. Legislators ignored it. The American populace ignored it. Foreign lobbying was not a concern, even as it grew into the behemoth that it now is. And it really wasn't until the late 2010s that legislators began really even beginning to bother enforcing it. That was one element. But there was another element, as you mentioned a moment ago, Ian, the loopholes. And there are a number of them, two of which I wanted to touch on today. One has to do with this other piece of regulation called the Lobbying Disclosure Act, which was implemented in the mid-1990s. The reason that legislators implemented that is because they didn't want, again, the argument they put forth is that they didn't want commercial entities who were supposed to be part of these kind of this broader thrust of market forces spreading around the world in the post-Cold War period that would help encourage along the way democratic movements, again, free market leading to free societies. They didn't want those lobbyists representing foreign corporate clients to have to register with FARA. And so what they ended up doing is making a less stringent requirement process. So you don't have to disclose who you're contacting on behalf of your client. You don't even necessarily have to disclose who all of your clients are, how much money you're making. It was a less stringent disclosure requirement, which a lot of foreign firms that are nominally independent but are effective proxies for those regimes realized they could circumvent even the Foreign Agents Registration Act doing that. So that's one loophole right there. The other loophole I wanted to flag right now was the legal loophole for the Foreign Agents Registration Act. If you go back to the 1960s, there were a number of amendments for the Foreign Agents Registration Act. And one of those was legislators saying, look, if you're a lawyer or a law firm and you're representing this client in the court of law, you shouldn't have to register as a lobbyist. And again, you see the logic of that. They're providing, again, basic due process for their clients. They're not lobbying on their behalf. In many ways, it's a perfectly fine loophole. But again, unfortunately, it has been abused time and again by American law firms that we have seen in recent years grow into one of the major prongs of the foreign lobbying space, no longer just representing clients in the court of law, which is where the loophole is supposed to be applied, but now bringing all of these other services, whether it's PR, whether it's consultancy, whether it's basic lobbying 101, and opening doors to contacts and colleagues in Washington, D.C., all while continuing to use this legal loophole that doesn't require them to register any of this work whatsoever. So anyways, those are a couple of the loopholes that I wanted to mention right now. I know Scott has been working extremely closely on some legislative fixes on this, so I'd love to hear what he thinks, and of course, Elaine's perspective as well.
Great, thank you so much. And with that, I'm going to turn to our panelists, starting with Elaine. Elaine, much of your work frames the broader geopolitical challenge of authoritarian influence and various forms of economic coercion that rogue regimes use. How do you see the global corruption challenge and the growing axis of authoritarian influence?
Thanks, Ian. It's great to be here. Casey, congratulations on a fantastic book. I think it's a book that needed to be written, and you do it in an informative and pretty entertaining way for a heavy topic. So really well done. I'll just start by mentioning that I work for the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, where I run the Center on Economic and Financial Power. We are an independent, nonpartisan think tank. We never have and never will take foreign money of any kind from any kind of foreign entity, and that's very important to the work that we do. Ian, to your question, there is a growing attention and even, I would say, war between democracy and authoritarian interests, and it's playing out globally in many ways. And when I think about democracy and how it's inherently stronger than authoritarianism in many ways, particularly in an economic way, we also have vulnerabilities in the ways that open, law-based, free speech systems can be manipulated by authoritarian actors. And of course, that's really what we're talking about today. This proliferation of misinformation, closed-door lobbying, political contributions, and even our judicially protected property rights, which can all be leveraged by dictators and oligarchs and criminals to weaken our political and financial system. So it's not without irony that we spend hundreds of billions of dollars strengthening our defense systems, promoting democracy, supporting democracy in many ways, and yet the front door is open to influence our political systems. It's somewhat shameful. So, the greatest power that authoritarian governments have over us really depends on their ability to use opacity and secrecy in many ways, including our own laws and our own financial systems. So driving that influence and that funding, that's happening, right, through the identification of shell companies and other ways that coercion is taking place, particularly within the global financial system. So we have to bring all of that to light. We have to really take this opacity and rid it of our system. And the place to start is with a conversation. And I think, again, this book is extremely useful because it brings these conversations into a space where Americans who care about this or want to understand more about what's happening, how systems are being influenced, can learn a lot about that and become a little bit smarter in terms of the pressure that we put on legislators to make change. So we need to prioritize this concept of radical transparency across economic and political systems. I think there are a lot of ways that we can do that. At FDD, we're looking at that through the lens of the economic and financial system, whether we're talking about transparency in our trade agreements, transparency in rules of origin, transparency in terms of shell corporations and governance structures. So all of this needs to happen in some sort of coordinated way. And I think this is really the challenge. We have a somewhat piecemeal approach to strengthening our systems of governance and taking a much broader view on that, and how the pieces of that puzzle work together is important. So it's not just about the influence of shell corporations. It's also about the enforcement actions of the FCPA. It's about the new Foreign Extortion Protection Act, which is really a game-changing piece of legislation that will get to the demand side of bribery. It's about enforcing FARA and probably tweaking FARA in some somewhat fundamental ways to make it meaningful and useful and fit for purpose for 2024 and beyond. So we need to do all of these things. We need to do it in concert with our democratic allies and partners as well. This influence from authoritarian regimes is coming from everywhere into many democratic societies. And we see that with election interference. We see it with misinformation. We see it with the co-optation of other financial systems in other democracies. So these are shared problems. And it's really time to get on the ball and do something about it. So I think we're on our way, but there's more work to be done.
Great, thanks, Elaine. Before I turn to Scott, I wanted to remind participants that you can ask your own questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So please do submit those questions. Scott, I wanted to turn to a good news story and get your perspective on how this particular reform came to pass. So a bit of background in terms of the 2023 annual defense spending bill. Congress included a bipartisan measure that bars all future secretaries and undersecretaries of state from ever advising or representing any foreign government, governing foreign political party, or majority foreign government-owned or controlled entity. So they would be banned from doing this kind of lobbying before U.S. executive branch officials. It also bars every other Senate-confirmed employee of the State Department from doing the same within 3 years of leaving that position. And with regard to 6 particularly high-risk, quote-unquote, countries of concern, including China and Russia, from ever providing those services. So could you give us a bit of a background on, how this particular provision made it into law and how this might be the foundation of a broader effort to deal with the problem that Casey has been describing?
Thanks, Ian, and congrats, Casey, on the book as well. It's an incredibly timely read, especially with so many of the headlines that we've seen in the last few weeks here. I think what's really important when we think about this topic is to understand how this is a corruption issue as well, and it's bi-directional. So when we think about these folks, cashing in on their government service to go advise and help authoritarian regimes, obviously that helps the authoritarian, often corruption-financed regimes overseas. It gives them a veneer of authenticity. It gives them the American approval when they have these high-level former U.S. Government officials working on their behalf. But it also impacts faith in our own democracy at home. This is one of the reasons, Ian, you mentioned the reform that passed a couple of years ago. It's one of the reasons that that's supported by the largest pro-democracy coalition in the United States, the Declaration for American Democracy, the same group that's behind efforts to bring transparency into money in our political system and to uphold our access to the ballot and affirm our voting rights in the US. They understand that these issues really erode public confidence in our own democracy here. When you see folks who are taking the access, the influence, the contacts, the networks that they have acquired through government service, and they cash in on that in order to help out a foreign regime, it makes Americans wonder, why did these people get into public service in the first place? Did they only do that in order to be able to have something they can make, get a dividend on the other side of it? So what we refer to as the Carden-Risch rule that you mentioned was passed a couple of years ago. And as you said, it basically says if you're the top 2 people in power at the State Department, you can never work for a foreign government after you leave your service. And if you are any Senate confirmed person, so the folks who run divisions at the State Department, the folks who are some of the most senior folks there, they have a 3-year cooling off period, as they call it. And if it's one of these, some of the worst, China, Russia, Venezuela, Syria, Iran, they can never work on behalf of them. I think this came because there was a mutual understanding that because of the high level of risk that a lot of senior State Department officials have, these are the folks, ambassadors, division heads who are working a lot overseas, they are subject to those potential pulls of wanting to work on behalf of a foreign regime, right? They are the ones on the front lines of our democracy. And in order to protect them, the Congress rightly understood that we need to place at least a cooling off period, and for the most senior of those officials, an absolute ban. There is also a bipartisan effort coming together to make that rule the standard across the entire government. If you are in that level of seniority and influence and public trust in the United States, you should never be able to cash in on that government experience for a foreign regime, regardless of where it may be, or the relationship that you had during your time of service. Government service is a public trust. These folks should not be able to use this, let alone for an authoritarian or corrupt government influence, but writ large. There is a bill coming together. Senator Warren's office is leading a larger anti-corruption package that has some of the strongest provisions we've ever seen on this front. But there is very strong bipartisan support for trying to expand the rule for the State Department. This is really a question of prioritization. How can we get people, through efforts like Casey's book and elsewhere, to maintain focus on these issues and understand that it is really not just a risk to our national security, not just a risk to our own public's faith in American democracy, but it really is helping and enabling some of our worst adversaries overseas to allow American high-level officials to go pursue this work after the time comes.
And Scott, the officials that are doing this lobbying are not just in the State Department. They're even military officers who've retired from the armed forces and then are advising foreign governments. Could you talk about an example of that and how Congress is trying to respond to that issue?
Yeah, too many examples, unfortunately, and a lot of this time it takes place in partner countries in the Middle East where they have conflicting foreign policy goals with the United States and often adversarial oppositional goals of the United States foreign policy. So folks may remember just a couple of years ago, a former four-star general who was out of government for about a decade and heading the Brookings Institution was under investigation by the DOJ. They ultimately dropped that investigation, but it was whether he was illegally lobbying on behalf of Qatar without registering under FARA. But there are many more examples of these folks because, again, they are in highly exposed situations. They are often the go-to contacts for some of these foreign countries when they are trying to understand and develop their own military capacities. And so they are, when they leave their time in government service, recruited by these governments in order to give, not just the technical expertise, but the political relationships that they have acquired. There was an effort introduced a couple of years ago, Republicans and Democrats alike, to ban all flag officers, all generals, anyone who was basically approved by the Senate for their commission, which is essentially every officer in the US military, from ever being able to go and lobby or consult on behalf of a foreign government. The Washington Post had a fantastic survey of this issue, came out last year, and really detailed far too many officers who are compelled by these invitations and opportunities by foreign governments, including authoritarian governments, to go cash in on their expertise. It's an area of bipartisan consensus. Again, it's really just how do we prioritize this and how do we make this something that can rise to the top amid a very polarized and a very busy legislative environment.
Ian, can I just jump in
Yeah.
for one quick moment? I did want to say, everything that Scott was saying reminded me of from a quote in the book. If I could just read for a moment, it's not my quote. It's from someone else. And the quote is, "No man whose former high public position has given him extraordinary influence in the community has the right to sell that influence, the trust and confidence of his fellow citizens, to a foreign government." These are members of Congress who said this. This was in 1869 when they said this. This was over 150 years ago in the middle of the biggest foreign lobbying scandal of the 19th century, when the Russian government the Tsarist government had secretly hired a former Treasury Secretary to act as their mouthpiece during the sale of Alaska, in addition to paying off other journalists and potentially even bribing other members of Congress. We talked earlier about the lineage of this industry, of these fights, of the questions surrounding foreign lobbying. This goes back to at least the 1860s in terms of concerns about these highest ranking members of the American government, then selling their services to the highest bidders abroad. And so what Scott mentioned just a moment ago is, thankfully, arguably 150 years too late, but thankfully, finally progress in this space that is going to go a long way toward finally clamping down on some of these realities and some of these networks that not only erode trust in, but at the end of the day, threaten our democracy right here in the United States of America.
Great. So I've been told, I've heard that there's an important presidential election coming up. You hear it first on this webinar. What do you think a future presidential administration, in January, coming into office, what are some of the most important steps that they could take on their own to deal with foreign influence in American politics? Maybe I'll ask Scott first, but if Elaine and Casey, you have other ideas, actionable ideas that a new administration could carry forward. Scott?
So the president has tremendous power to set policy for executive branch officials. When the Trump administration came into office, part of their ethics pledge was that if you work for this administration, you cannot go after your term of service and engage in lobbying activities on behalf of a foreign government. The Biden administration made that even stronger. And they said, not only can you not lobby, you can't engage in any activity that would cause you to register under FARA. So basically, you can't be a political intelligence officer. You can't try to influence public opinion in the United States on behalf of a foreign government. Unfortunately, at the end of the Trump administration, President Trump waived those restrictions on all of his executive branch employees. So they were able to effectively, at the end of his term, go and pursue that work. It is very important for us to make sure that this is not precedent in 2025, regardless of what happens next month, that presidents do not feel like they could release these high-level officials to go and be able to lobby and cash in on their government service for a foreign government. So we have to pay attention to, the outgoing revolving door, if you will, of the Biden administration. But on day one, this is something that every presidential administration has done. They have an ethics pledge. They can't legally constrain what their employees are going to do after their time in government, but they require every high-level government employee to say that they will not engage in certain activities. And it's incredibly important, whoever comes into office in January 2025, that they replicate what the Biden administration did in January 2021 and say, if you are going to assume some of these highest positions of public trust, you cannot, on your way out the door, go and pursue a lobbying, consulting, or advising role on behalf of the foreign government.
Great. Elaine, any thoughts?
Yeah, I would definitely echo the focus on making sure the lobbying restrictions are in place, particularly for appointees. But I think there's also a very basic step that could be taken, which is to continue to talk about these issues so that we don't lose the thread, we don't lose the narrative, we don't allow ourselves, or the new administration doesn't allow itself to put these issues on the back burner. Even though it may take some time to get the kinds of reforms that we've been talking about, we have to keep the drumbeat going. And I think, the president plays a very, very important role in keeping these issues front and center. I would also highlight resourcing appropriately. The FARA work is really important. We need to have enough people. We need to have enough tools to be able to go through registrations to ensure that they're accurate, to ensure that red flags are identified in a timely fashion. There's plenty of technology and operational process that could be put in place to make that work. But we have to get serious about wanting to enforce FARA. on a much greater scale. And then I think also in terms of resourcing, it's important as FIPA comes into force that FIPA is also properly resourced. So making sure that we have some really good and hopefully high profile prosecutions under the Foreign Extortion Protection Act, that would be a really nice way to start off with a strong message about how important it is to get to the demand side. So all of these things work in concert along with the Corporate Transparency Act and other initiatives that are underway. So it could be a full court press, and again, really highlighting how we can't leave the front door open to foreign influence.
Can I just add? So there is a very significant distinction between some other countries, authoritarian countries, using foreign registration, and lobbying acts to silence civil society, to be able to, discredit organizations that have some amount of funding from outside their own borders. FARA is not that. As Casey said, this is an extension of the First Amendment. It's not about censoring speech. It is about bringing transparency to that speech. So oftentimes when we talk about these issues, unfortunately, in some countries, most recently in Georgia, they passed a very heavy-handed, foreign registration law that essentially tries to stop and discredit organizations that have significant foreign, contributions or stakeholders involved in that organization. That is not what we're talking about here. We are not attempting to silence any kind of speech. We just want the American public to be able to understand where those messages are coming from. And so, very importantly, this can be used as a shield and unfortunately by our authoritarian adversaries as a sword. But the American way of pursuing these kind of provisions has never been intended and does not operate like that. It is simply a way of bringing light to who was influencing our public discourse and our politics.
Ian, could I add two more points?
Sure.
Scott's comment got me thinking about it. I think we also need to be really mindful of what's happening at the state and local level within the US and the ability for foreign influence to proliferate at levels that maybe are going even more undetected because there isn't the capacity or the focus as to where that foreign interference may be playing out in local development activities, foreign direct investment. There are many examples that I think we could look at, but we have to protect ourselves at every level of government. And so that might be another area where the next administration could really put a focus on increasing the conversation between the federal and the state and the local level to see how all of our tools could be working in a more coordinated fashion. So that's one issue. And then maybe picking up on the sort of civil society component to this. We already talked a bit about think tanks and how foreign money can easily go into that think tank conversation and discourse and influence in different ways. But there are lots of ways that foreign money comes into educational institutions, to other entities, other kinds of research organizations, and we need to start shining a light on that as well, and linking that as well into the influence operations and foreign and U.S. representatives of these foreign entities as they help bring money into these other areas of our society that also may be going undetected.
If I could just hop on Elaine's final comment there. I mean, look, echoing everything Elaine and Scott said, whether it's enforcement, whether it's increasing capacity for investigation and prosecution, whether it's supporting the legislative fixes, all of this is absolutely a must. But Elaine, your comment reminded me, we haven't talked about it much this conversation, but the role of universities, the increasing role of universities and educational institutes. We talked earlier about how think tanks currently in the legal architecture of the U.S. do not have to disclose any foreign donations or foreign funding to the Department of Justice or to legislators. Universities, though, do. For decades, there's been regulation on the books for American universities that are the recipients of quote unquote significant gifts, generally about $250,000 and more. Any university receiving any of these foreign gifts from any foreign government, be they democratic or otherwise, is supposed to disclose that information to the Department of Education, which then, of course, is supposed to disclose that information to the rest of us. You can go back to the 1960s and the 1980s to look at where this legislation developed, but it was similar to foreign lobbying in the US, completely unenforced for decades, up until very, very recently, up until the late 2010s, when the Department of Education finally conducted its very first high-profile investigation into the role of universities, and beyond that, how foreign regimes, again, malign, kleptocratic, dictatorial, authoritarian regimes, were targeting American universities as vectors for foreign influence. It was a relatively restricted investigation. If I remember correctly, it was only about a dozen universities that were investigated. But the Department of Education discovered that there was some $6.5 billion that was supposed to have been disclosed in foreign financing, in foreign funding to the Department of Education that had not been. And again, this is not from the Canadas or the Irelands or the New Zealands of the world, but from the Saudis and the Qatars and the Russias and the Chinas of the world. And Ian, you mentioned, you asked earlier about some more memorable or maybe even funny stories from this. And I have to say, one of the funniest quotes in putting this entire book together was when regulators or officials at Cornell University, which is it's a wonderful university, but they were one of the organizations investigated. If I remember correctly, there was nearly $250 million they had not disclosed in foreign funding. And when officials from the federal government asked them about that, the only word they could use to describe their lack of transparency was dumbfounded, which, again, I was very much dumbfounded in reading that as well. So just wanted to flag that as we begin wrapping up toward the 1 o'clock hour.
Great, thanks. Yeah, we have just a few minutes left, so I wanted to give a final round of comments for folks, especially focused on, are there any policy reforms or initiatives that we haven't touched on yet that people in our audience should be aware of, should support? Casey, I know that your last chapter mentions a number of those initiatives and your thoughts on the reform agenda. So maybe I'll start with you, Casey, and then wrap up with Scott and then Elaine.
Sure. There are a few specific bills I write about in the final chapter. One of them is one of these wonderful congressional creations where it has a fantastic acronym attached to it called the SHAME Act, which I believe is the Stop Helping Adversaries Manipulate Everything Act. Scott, correct me if I'm wrong. That is what Scott mentioned earlier, preventing Americans from lobbying on behalf of a range of anti-American regimes: Russia, Iran, Syria, Cuba, a few others, if I recall correctly. Another one is called the Fighting Foreign Influence Act. And again, both of these coming with broad bipartisan support. That would, among other things, require transparency in the nonprofit sector for significant financial foreign financing. Right there again, which would theoretically apply to think tanks as well. As it pertains to FARA, the Foreign Agents Registration Act, it is clear as day that there needs to be some kind of civil penalty component. Right now, it's just criminal, which is an extremely high bar, and why we have seen some prosecutorial failures in recent years. There needs to be some kind of equivalent of a speeding ticket or some kind of civil injunction to require a firm or figure to register. It doesn't have to be just the threat of jail all the time. That has to be involved in there. There have been a number of other bills related to FARA reform in recent years. None of them have really gone anywhere. But as we learned recently, part of that is because they ended up dying in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, which until very recently was chaired by none other than Senator Bob Menendez, who, of course, was recently convicted of conspiring to act as a foreign agent. So, yes, I suppose if you want a bill on foreign lobbying reform to die, you send it to Bob Menendez. So those are just a few of the fixes we flagged in the book.
Great. Scott?
I'll mention a couple other. There's an effort called the Paid Off Act that's led by Senator Cornyn out of Texas. It would basically remove the exemption to FARA for 6 countries of concern, high-risk countries. They wouldn't be able to claim that they're just engaging in commerce, and so they don't have to register under FARA. We understand there's state-owned and influenced enterprises coming from these countries. We need a higher level of transparency for their engagement with the U.S. government here. It would also get rid of the Lobbying Disclosure Act, or LDA, exemption. Casey mentioned this earlier. This is one of the biggest loopholes in our system. Essentially, if you qualify as a lobbyist under federal law, you don't have to disclose your communications and identify yourself as a foreign agent to the US government, to the DOJ. And this is manipulated time and time again. It goes back 30 years that foreign entities have been able to claim that they are full-time lobbyists. They're representing foreign governments or political parties, and so they don't have to disclose their emails, their communications, and the public never sees this information under the auspices that they're already disclosing enough through the lobbying regulation. But the public doesn't get the details that we need on that. That's a bipartisan bill. It's Senator Whitehouse, Senator Cornyn. Look, I do think writ large, there is a real opportunity for the Congress to work together and get things done, especially after such high-level investigations and indictments. I mean, the mayor of New York City, this has really blown the roof off a lot of the public attention to these issues. As you mentioned, Senator Bob Menendez is the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. We are now in really unprecedented territory, at least in our lifetime in modern political history. And, some of the benefit of this is when it's happening on both sides, it means that Congress can have a farewell to arms and understand they should be able to work together on this. So I would leave folks with the idea that if we care about this, as we were saying earlier, we have to make sure this is still part of the public discourse. We have to pay attention in January for how the incoming administration handles this. And we have to make sure that this stays on the menu of much needed reforms. This is a corruption issue. This is a democracy issue. And we got to make sure that what become headlines don't just get lost in the mix, and it actually translates into policy change.
Yeah. Thanks. I mean, in addition to agreeing with all of those suggestions, I want to try to get to the question that came in from Michael Castleman about the role of the news, the media and newspapers in particular, and where the connection is to FARA. And I think what this question points to is the broader relationship between foreign influence, foreign funding, and what that's doing to our media, and how we get to some stronger, maybe enforceable code of ethics, whether we're talking about news organizations or public relations firms or others. I think there's a question about whether self-policing and self administered codes of ethics work or don't work. But that's something we should be thinking about and having a larger conversation, or perhaps registration of news organizations, to make the distinction between those that actually provide news and those that provide entertainment. And certainly having mechanisms in place to require news organizations to divulge where their funding is coming from. So these are all really important questions, and I'm glad that that particular angle was raised.
Yeah,
Great.
I'll just say to that point quickly, Elaine, we have seen increasing requiring for registration or even prosecution surrounding media entities or nominal media entities, most especially out of places like Russia, as well as China. There remains this kind of broader media exemption from foreign agents registration, but we have seen the Department of Justice continuing to reconsider that element, and I have no doubt that they will continue to reconsider that moving forward. And given the recent spate of indictments, I wouldn't be surprised if we see more indictments in this space moving forward.
Great. Well, thank you, Casey, Elaine, and Scott, for this great conversation. Casey, if you do end up having another book inside of you that's somehow manages to get out into the world, we will love to have you back and be part of another conversation. But for now, I just encourage people to pay attention to the websites of the FACT Coalition, Transparency International, FDD, for information on how these issues are developing, and especially how the reform efforts are coming along. So thank you so much for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, Ian.